we're going to take a step back and talk about absolute value equations. Now, hopefully, you remember what an absolute value is, hence this little emoji here, kind of implying the notation for absolute value, which you can see I have some examples written out already. But before we get to those examples, I want to talk about what's the definition of the absolute value of zero. I'm sorry, the definition of an absolute value. It just means the distance away from zero. But I have this highlighted here because I wanted to write something important. Because when we talk about distance, distance is always positive. So some of you might remember maybe from high school or middle school, wherever you learned about absolute value, is the absolute value is always positive, right? Sometimes those things stick in our mind. But the reason is because the idea for an absolute value, it doesn't care what side of the number line you're on. It just cares how far you are away from zero. It's just distance. That's why your answer always ends up being positive. So let's look at a couple examples of this. I remember when I was taught about absolute value, I was taught to count the number of units the number is away from zero. But the way a number line works is you are already given the distance by just looking at the number. All you need to remember is that the distance is always positive. So the absolute value of -2 is +2 because that's how far -2 is from zero. It's just 2. The negative part just tells you that it's on the left side of the number line, but the distance is still 2. And the reason why I didn't like the idea of like count how many units you are away from zero, let's say for example, if you were at -2, you would count 1 and then 2. But what happened when you get to weird fractions is where I struggled a bit. But once again, I would have preferred to have just been told the number already tells you its distance away from zero. All you need to remember is that because it just cares about the distance, you have to make sure to write that number as positive. Even if you couldn't pinpoint exactly where it is on a number line, well, the number itself already tells you where it is on the number line. Same thing here. The negative just means it's on the left side, but its distance is still 2.4389. The number already tells you the distance. The sign is just telling you on what side of the number line it is. But all you have to make sure is you give the number is the distance already, and you just have to make sure it's positive. What's the absolute value of zero? Well, zero is at zero. So my absolute value of zero is 0 because there is no distance. It's exactly at 0 already. So the note I wanted to make here is don't forget the outcome of, I'm going to put ABS for absolute value. The outcome of absolute value can only be positive because we're talking about distance. And sometimes that distance could also be 0, like in this example. And that's really important to know because we're going to be doing absolute value equations, meaning I'm going to have to find a number that gives me the distance that I'm looking for. But I also need to remember the distances are always going to be positive, or we could potentially only be 0. And that's going to come up in an example that we do that's really important. Now, I will give you some steps to follow to solve these equations, but sometimes I like to do some of these problems intuitively. Because, for example, there is no work for me to do here, but I can analyze what it's asking me for. It's asking me to find a number that when I apply the absolute value, I get 4. So that means I want a number that has a distance of 4. And there's 2 numbers that do that, right? Because if I draw a number line, let's think about this. If I draw a number line here at 0, we have 1, 2, 2, 3, and then 4. So that would be an answer, right? Because 4 is 4 units away from 0. So I would write one of my answers as 4. And I'll talk about what this is in a couple seconds. But I also know that there's another number that has that exact same distance, but that number is -4, because -4 is 4 units away from 0, right? The number tells you its distance. The sign is just telling you that it's either on the left or on the right side. But the outcome, when you apply the absolute value, is just going to talk about the distance. And these two distances are exactly the same. Hence, my other answer for x is going to be -4. Now, this is known as set notation, these curly braces. And we can use that to make our solution set. It's called, meaning that I get to write all the solutions for this equation in a set. A set just means a collection of objects. Since this is math, the objects we're collecting or listing are numbers. Now, if we look at the next example, same idea. Because I'm trying to find a number. Now, this one's a little different. Here, x was the only number I'm looking for. There's nothing manipulating that x. Now, the idea is still the same. I'm trying to think of a number that when I apply the absolute value, I'm going to get 4. That's the exact same thing we did in this previous one. Trying to find a number that gives me 4. And we know 4 and -4 did that. But now the only difference is we're taking that value of x and then we're adding 2 to that number. Then we apply the absolute value. But because of the previous example, I know if I have 4 in here or -4, when I apply the absolute value to either one of these, I know it's going to give me +4. So then I ask myself, what value of x, when I add 2, is going to give me a 4? And I don't have to do any fancy work. I can do this intuitively. I know +2 would be a solution. Because if I plug in 2 to x, 2 plus 2 is 4. The absolute value of 4 is +4. I also know that if I take the absolute value of -4, that will also give me +4. That's why this was part of my solution. But here, because I'm going to add 2 to that value of x, I know I'm going to need a -6 to do this. Because I know -6 plus 2 gives me -4, and the absolute value of -4 is, once again, +4. Like I said, sometimes we don't need to create more work for ourselves. Sometimes we can do this with just using our intuition. I will show you some techniques that sometimes will be helpful because doing things in your head is not always the best way to keep things organized. But if you can avoid having to do extra steps and you can process that all you're doing is choosing the x value that's being added by 2 and the outcome will have to be 4. And like I said, the numbers already tell you what the outcome is going to be. The absolute value is just telling you to make sure it's positive. Now, before you start creating rules on your own, for example, thinking, oh, absolute value always has 2 solutions. Well, there is a negative side and a positive side, and they're equal distant to 0. But that's not always going to be the case, because remember what we said, the outcome of absolute value can either be positive or 0. Now for this problem, I know the only way to get 0 as an answer, I need to have 0 inside my absolute value. And the only way to get 0 from x plus 2 is that my x will need to be negative 2. Because I know negative 2 plus 2 will give me 0. And the absolute value of 0 is 0. And if you notice, I'm not really doing any work here. This is just all through observation. All through understanding what is being asked of you to find. And in this one, just illustrates how sometimes you might just have one answer for your absolute value. Sometimes you might have 2. But you have to make sure to process it and think about what this equation is saying. In math, equations are like sentences, and you have to read them carefully. For example, this, at first glance, might feel overwhelming. Negative, variables, ugly fractions. But if you can look past everything, past all these complicated numbers, and you can read the sentence, is that you are going to find a value of x that's going to be multiplied. And then it's going to be added. And it's going to all simplify to a single number that you apply the absolute value to. And that number has to be the same, right? Because the same is meaning equal to this number. Now, hopefully, as you're watching this video, you recognize, wait, didn't we just make a note that the outcome for an absolute value can only be positive or 0? So what number can I plug into this absolute value that's going to give me a negative? And that is, there is none. This has no solution because it is impossible. It is impossible to get a negative out of the absolute value. So you really want to be on your toes when you're doing these problems. Because once I show you the steps to follow, sometimes students just want to follow our steps and not pay attention to the sentence in front of you. By sentence, I mean the equation given. Now, because this is impossible, that means there's no solution. And no solution can be written different ways. You can do this slash to imply no solution. Or you can just do your solution set and leave it empty, implying there was no solution. Either one of these is perfectly fine with me. But again, these 4 examples are just to get you to understand what's happening when we're solving these and what to be careful for when you're doing them. Now let me give you the steps we're going to follow. So here we go. First, you want to make sure your absolute value is isolated. So you isolate absolute value. And here's a quick note before you move on to step 2. Once it's isolated, you want to look out for negatives or 0. Well, why is that? Well, we just saw an example that our absolute value is isolated and it's equal to something negative, and that is impossible. No solution, empty set, however you want to write your answer. But that's why you want to think about these problems. It's not just as simple as follow step 1, 2, 3 and you get an answer. Sometimes you get your answer earlier on if you can interpret the equation. Now, why look out for 0? Well, because if you notice, we went from having 2 solutions to only 1, and that's because of 0. Because you can't be the same distance from 0 2 different ways, if that makes sense. Because you're either at 0 or you're at 0. There's no positive or negative 0. So you're at 0 and the distance will be 0. So that only leaves you with one solution. But you either get one solution or you get no solutions. At the end of the day, you still need to make sure you look out. Once it's isolated though, not beforehand. Because sometimes students might see, for example, if we look here, you might see a negative right away and think, oh, I cannot be no solution. Again, it's not at the beginning of the problem. It's once the absolute value is completely isolated. Then you pay attention to if it's equal to a negative or 0. And if we look at this first example, there is no isolation yet. This is multiplication. So that means I'm going to take both sides of this equation and divide by 2 to isolate my absolute value. That's going to leave me with the absolute value of 3 minus 2t is equal to 3. Now, if you see, I said my next step is to write 2 equations. Why do I need 2 equations? Technically, I don't, right? We're able to do these 2 examples without writing these so-called equations. But when there's a lot more involved, here's a trick I like to follow. Similar to the explanation I give to this example, is that I'm looking for a value that when I apply the absolute value to that number, it's going to give me positive 3. Well, I know the absolute value of 3 will give me 3. I also know the absolute value of negative 3 will also give me that positive 3. So the idea is I want this absolute value to become either 3 or negative 3. And that's where the 2 equations come from. I'm going to write 3 minus 2t equals positive 3, or 3 minus 2t equals negative 3. And you could have done this in this example. You could have taken x plus 2 and set it equal to 4. Or you could have done x plus 2, set it equal to negative 4. Not because that's what your x is going to be. It's because that's what you need the inside of the absolute value to be able to get a positive 4. But again, I didn't do it here because sometimes we can use our intuition and that helps us go a little bit quicker. Now, I need to isolate my variable. To do so, I am going to subtract by 3 on both sides. Cancels on your left. I'm left with negative 2t is equal to 0. And now don't get this mixed up. Don't think, oh wait, you told me something about 0. Yes, I did. But that was with when the absolute values were still present and then isolated. Since they're isolated and there's no negatives, I look here and I had to recognize this is not either negative or 0, which I said to look out for when doing these examples. Now, I divide both sides by negative 2. And that leaves me with the answer of 0, which makes sense. Because if I plug in 0 into t, negative 2 times 0 is 0. 3 minus 0 is 3. The absolute value of 3 is positive 3. Next portion, same thing. Subtract 3 on both sides. Leaves me with negative 2t is equal to negative 6. Divide both sides by negative 2. And I'm left with t is equal to 3. So my solution is 0 and 3. And you can check it by just plugging back into your original equation, which I'll check 0 really quick. 0 times negative 2 is 0. 3 minus 0 is 3. The absolute value of 3 is 3. And then times 2 gives me my positive 6. Let's try another example. Same thing here. I am going to subtract 7 on both sides. And the reason for that is I usually like to take care of the terms before I take care of the factors. Now, what are terms? They are separated by plus or minus signs. What are factors? They are separated by multiplication. So I like to take care of the terms first, which some people would say anything adding or subtracting. Then I take care of anything multiplying or dividing. By doing this, I get 5 times the absolute value of 2 minus 4t. The 7's cancel. That leaves me with 50. I can now divide by 5 to both sides. That leaves me with 2 minus 4t, close absolute value, equal to 10. Now once, like we said, once isolated, there's no constant terms, there's no factors. Once isolated, I need to look to the side of my constant and see if there is a negative or 0. Because if there's a negative, this was never a solution to begin with, or didn't have one to begin with. Now if it's 0, can have one, but it will only be 1. So something to think about. But once again, as long as this isn't 0 or negative, you can continue with the problem. Have 2 minus 4t equals 10. Right? Because the idea is I need a number inside these absolute value that gives me positive 10. What's going to do that? Well, positive 10 will and negative 10 will. So if I set it equal to positive 10, I will subtract 2 to both sides. That leaves me with negative 4t equals to 8. Divide both sides by negative 4. And then I'm left with t is equal to negative 2. But let's not forget, I need to make my other problem. But now it's going to be equal to negative 10. Not because of this, it's because of the absolute value. I need a negative 10 inside, because when I apply the absolute value, I know I get a positive 10 out. So same thing again, I'm going to subtract 2 on both sides of the equation. Normally you want to write things in a straight line, not like this bottom I did here, which I'll just leave it there for now. That does leave me with negative 4t on one side and then negative 12 on the other. Now I divide by negative 4 to both sides, and that leaves me with t is equal to positive 3. Like I said, you can write your solution set notation, which would be negative 2 and positive 3. And I believe I have a couple more. Now, once again, absolute value is isolated. It's equal to a negative. This has no solution. Because absolute value can never be negative. Now if we look here, I'm going to subtract 15 on both sides. Unfortunately, that cancels the 15 on your left. You're left with 13x plus 7, still inside my absolute value. Now, once it's isolated, you should have noticed, wait, there's a 0 here. What do I remember about 0? There's only one way this outcome can be 0. So to find this, I do the same thing I did with my inequality. I take the equation inside this absolute value, set it, without the absolute value, set it equal to 0 because I want this inside to be 0 because of this number here. So because I want inside to be 0, then this 3x plus 17 has to be 0. Oops, sorry about that. I'll move this a bit. Oh, not that one. Here we go. I'm going to subtract 17 on both sides. Take care of the terms before of the factors. So 17's cancel. 3x is equal to negative 17. I divide by 3. That leaves me with a solution set of negative 17 over 3. Now, I prefer whole numbers over mixed numbers and over decimals. So a problem like this, I'm perfectly okay with you leaving as negative 17 over 3. So, what to take away? Biggest things. The absolute value, the outcome, can only be positive or 0. And sometimes we can do these problems through intuition. Because once our absolute value is isolated, you just need to look at what the equation is asking for. And once you can find that, either with 2 equations, no equations, or 1 equation, you can find your solution. So again, just be mindful. Isolate, And then watch out for negatives and zeros.